Thanks, Robin.
Thank you.
You ready for pension reform? Well,
gee, thanks, Jack. Go ahead, Ed.
it's going to do a overview of the legislation for you. The only thing I wanted to preface it is by we really do have some strenuous communication responsibilities here. You know, everybody likes to get out of the blocks and explain what happened at the legislature. Unfortunately, some of those early communications from other parties were deadly inaccurate about the benefit changes and things like that. So that's why we want to do our best here to get things on our website, get things out to the membership, get ahead of it if we can. But there are parts of it Ed will highlight for you today that may not be so clear to anyone and may need further clarification in the next legislative session. So there's clearly a few soft spots of confusion that we'll highlight for you. You know, our call center, I just got a note from them, and to Peggy and I, and it looks like we're not getting a lot of calls on this yet. Actually, only 6 to 10 on pension reform so far, which isn't much for a call center like ours. Actually, there's a lot more calls on insurance deductions apparently than pension reform. But that will change, I guess, as people start to digest this and want to know the impact on them. So it gives us some chance here to start to form the communications. So, Ed, if you want to start.
Yeah, just a couple of comments, as Jack mentioned, about, you know, there are some issues that we need to discuss with you, and then probably get some clarification from the legislature and the administration about what was intended. And clearly we're going to have to do a lot of conforming of our law to what was enacted, because what was enacted in AB 340 were not changes to the teachers' retirement law, but to provisions of the government code that apply to all the affected pension plans, meaning us, CalPERS, and the county retirement systems. And so there's like one set of language that's applicable to all three types of pension plans. So in addition to having to conform our law to that, just so there's no confusion about what law is in effect, there are some issues just because there are some differences between us and the other systems that we want to make sure that we properly conform to it. But before I go through that, I just want to acknowledge Joycelyn Martinez-Wade, who spent an enormous amount of time and effort working with us on trying to get this to work right, and drafting and redrafting and redrafting language and making sure that we fully understood what the impact of what was being proposed would have on our operations. And it was a tremendous amount of work. And even though a lot of that language didn't end up in the bill for one reason or another, when we go next year to try to conform to it, a lot of the work will already be done. So I just want to acknowledge all the work that she did in terms of getting us to where we are now. So let me sort of start out with what the bill does. And, you know, and I want to sort of focus on what the bill does with future members, what the bill does to all members. And, you know, and I think one of the most important things that we communicate to people is that the most significant aspects of the bill apply only to future members. Is that the existing membership of the defined benefit program the effects on them are much more limited. And one of the concerns that people have always expressed is, should I retire now, or, you know, can I wait? And quite honestly, whatever would occur to them by retiring now, it won't be any different if they wait. I mean, the changes that are occurring to current members are going to affect them whether it affects them whether they retire now or retire after this bill takes effect. But so the most significant ones apply to new members, and this is one of the significant things, is what's a new member, and this is one of the changes that was somewhat defined in our law, but it's not consistent with what the legislation was doing and what it was intending to do with public employees in general. The way that the language was drafted in the bill, a new member is, for purposes of CalSTRS, a person who first became a member on or after January 1, 2013. So that's different from the way it normally works with our plan, whereas if somebody, in most circumstances, somebody was a member, quit teaching, took a refund, came back to teaching, they would forfeit their rights to benefits. So whatever plan was in effect at the time they returned to teaching is the plan that would be applicable to them. But because the legislation uses the term first hired, that we understand that, we interpret it, and it's consistent with other provisions of the bill, that if somebody was a member before 2013, even if they quit CalSTRS, quit teaching, took a refund, and then came back to work, they would be subject to the provisions of the existing program and not subject to the changes that are going to be applicable to the future members. So that's very different than the way it usually works with us and most other pension plans, but that's a significant change. So for example, somebody who may have taught 5 years ago, quit teaching, took their money out, and comes back to work next year will not be considered a new member. They will be subject to the provisions of the existing program.
What type of visibility do we have, Ed, of them being a prior member?
We know it's on the system. We actually confirmed that today with IT, that we actually know the date of their original membership date, so we know what their original membership date was.
So we'd have matching
We do
Social
have
Security
that.
and
We
all
have
that
that.
kind of. Okay.
Yes,
All right.
we would have that.
Even
yeah.
name changes and things like that.
So it would be
still
tied back to the Social Security number.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's not a concern. It's not a date we typically use, but we do have it. Now, in terms of the bill as it applied to the other retirement systems, though, they were trying to have an even broader grandfathering of public employees into the existing plan. That if you had worked for let's say you had worked under CalSTRS and then went to go work for a county retirement system after 2013, they intended to have that person be subject to the county retirement plan that was in effect before 2013. So basically, by virtue of being a public employee before the bill takes effect, they meant to have the existing provisions of the pension plan applicable to them, even if they were new to that retirement system. So if that's what they intend to do with our members, that is a change that we're going to have enacted into legislation next year to make that happen, because the way that they drafted that language, from our perspective, we do not believe that the language would have applied to our members. So that's a change that we're going to have to make sure that we fully understand what they wanted to do, but that is our initial understanding, and that we will take care of that next year in legislation. So, but in any case, at the very least, we know that people who used to be CalSTRS members and become CalSTRS members again are not subject to that. But if somebody is brand new to public education, brand new to CalSTRS, after the end of this year, they will be subject to these new provisions.
What happens though in the year of limbo between the language not being clear and us being able to clear?
Well, I would presume we'll have to obviously work at it. Off the top of my head, it would seem plausible that we could define that basically we would apply them to the old plan retroactively, I guess, for lack of a better term. I don't want to make it sound like it's really retroactive, but basically we would define a person who was a member of any plan before January 1, 2013. But I'll let the other lawyers weigh in on that.
We need to get legal review on
Yeah.
that. It's a hard-
Subject to close legal review.
Yes.
Because that's I think you and I have talked about that. I mean, the concern is when the language
Yeah.
is not clear and we can't clean it up for a year,
Well, and it's difficult because we clearly can't, all we can say is this is what it is, and we can hope to fix that. But what it is the way I've just described it, and we can see what we can do to try to fix that. So here are the changes that are applicable to the new members, as we talked about. The first thing is that the normal retirement age, which is currently age 60, will now increase to age 62. And that has a greater impact in terms of what's defined as the normal retirement age, has a greater impact as we start talking about what people can do if they want to work after retirement. But the most significant change to that is that it does change, in terms of something I'll show you in a second, it does change the age factor. What is now 2% at age 60 will become 2% at age 62. But in a second, I'll show you how the age factors change throughout the entire continuum of retirement ages. The other significant change is that right now, generally speaking, you have to be age 55 in order to retire with 5 years of service. But if you had 30 years of service, you could retire as early as age 50. Under this bill, you will not be able to retire any earlier than age 55, no matter how many years of service you've got, at least for CalSTRS members. CalPERS and the county systems, it's a little bit lower than that. The other significant change is that the maximum age factor, the 2.4 that currently exists at age 63, for future members, they'll get that age factor at age 65. So,
Hang on.
Sure, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go,
I
go,
just
Mike, go.
I just had a clarifying point on that applies to the first time member again. And you are not proposing that any future legislative change you're not proposing to change what it says. You're saying that we probably need legislation to clarify what the rules are?
No, what we're comfortable with what the rules are now. What we're saying is the legislature intended to do something different than legislation would have to be enacted to make that change, to make that intent enacted. But it's entirely up to the legislature. We would tell them, the bill you passed does this. If you meant to do this, then there has to be a change in the law to make that happen. And it's entirely up to them.
But you were saying there's inconsistent treatment.
Yes, there is.
Between CalSTRS members and other public employee
Right.
systems. And that seems odd to us that it's probably a reflection just of haphazard writing. It doesn't make sense to carve us out of that provision. So Ed was urging consistency.
Yes. And based on our conversations with the legislative staff, we believe they intended to treat the CalSTRS members consistently with the other public employees. And so and they clearly understand that there's going to have to be a number of, at the very least, changes in the teacher's retirement law to conform to what they've enacted in the government code. And they recognize that some things will undoubtedly have to be clarified as well. And so we'll work with them going through each piece of this methodically to make sure we understand what they wanted to do and making the appropriate changes in our law to make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
So, oh, sorry. Shouldn't.
Quick question, just to clarify on that last slide, the last bullet point. Maximum age factor, 65? I was under the impression it was 67, 2.5 at 67.
Not for CalSTRS members. CalSTRS members were treated differently in this. The way for CalPERS in the county, it was minimum age of 52 for non-safety, minimum age of 52, maximum age factor of 2.5 at 67. For us, it's a minimum age of 55, maximum age factor of 2.4 at 65.
So if they had sought consistency, it would have been a benefit enhancement,
Right.
actually, for our members. And I think that was the dilemma they were debating there, to increase that factor up. 2.4. It stays the same. In order to stay the same, they lowered the age threshold as the compromise.
Right. So, now, moving to the new table. So on the top row, you see the ages and then what the current factor is, and then below that, what the new factors are. And essentially, if you look at it, generally speaking, except for maybe the first year of age 55, it's basically what the age factor is currently for a given age. That same age factor will occur now for a member 2 years later. So effectively, to get the same benefit, or to get the same percentage of final compensation per year of service, a person's going to have to work 2 years longer until you get to around age 65, in order to get what's currently provided to an existing member. But these will be the new age factors for the future members. Any questions about that? You can see what that looks like. And then related to that is the career factor, which is currently in addition to the age factor for people who retire with 30 years or more, gets eliminated for the future members. So basically, it's the age factor, regardless of how many years of service you get that age factor, and there's no enhancement to that for people who work a long career. It's 2.4 at 65, and that's it. You can't get it any earlier by having more years. One very significant change for the future members is a compensation cap. It's equal to 120% of the wage base upon which Social Security payroll taxes and benefits are based on, which this year is equal to about $132,000, but we won't know what that cap is until the Social Security Administration tells us what the 2013 number is. And then going forward, that number will get adjusted each year for changes in the Consumer Price Index. So for the first year, it's tied to Social Security wage base. Beyond that, it's adjusted up or down depending upon the CPI.
So even though the Social Security wage base changes, it stays the anchor, the 2013 number. I mean, This is a little odd, but nevertheless.
That's what it is.
So the base stays the 213 Social Security wage base, but using the CPI as the indexer going forward, rather than the indexing of the Social Security benefit, which would have been another way of doing it.
And the reason why it's 120% is because our members are not in Social Security. For a system that is in Social Security, such as CalPERS for state employees, such as ourselves, the cap is 100% of the Social Security wage base, so that's about $110,000. So people who are employees who are outside of Social Security can have a greater amount of their compensation counting towards retirement benefit than those who are in Social Security.
So, Jack, because it's 120% of the 2013 wage base, even if Congress made that less in future years, it would stay that base because it's not based on the Social Security wage base. It's just on the 2013 number. Okay.
Yeah, but the legislature in the bill reserved the right to change it if there was a modification how it got calculated. So it's not like the legislature is boxed in that it has to stay the way no matter what. They could elect to make a change to that. Quite honestly, I mean, the discussions that have taken place is to increase the wage base, not to decrease the wage base. So it's more likely to occur the other way. And so what happens when you hit the cap is that the member and the employer and the state would no longer pay contributions on any income above that cap, and it would not count towards final compensation. So that's it. There is no benefit that CalSTRS would provide. All that income above the limit becomes invisible. The employer can offer a defined contribution plan for the income above that. But the employer's contributions can't be at any greater rate than what they contribute towards the defined benefit plan. So they couldn't, for example, for an administrator who's making $150,000, they could have a DC plan for the difference between what the cap is and $150,000, but they couldn't contribute any more than what the employer contribution rate is for the DB, the 8 1/4, what's currently 8 1/4, right? So the advantage of this, I mean, the nice thing about this is the bright line that we've been looking for as far as spiking is concerned. If this were applicable to existing members, which it's not, but if it were, it would affect about 4,500 members who make over $132,000 a year. Generally speaking, those members that have the most likelihood of having a pension that is spiked is going to be above the cap, and so no matter what they do to their income, it's not going to affect their benefit. So it makes it much easier for us to administer anti-spiking mechanisms because whatever they do won't have any impact on the margin.
We should talk for a minute just about those top half plans, just the issues around that for a second. Just, again, one of the miscommunications initially was, that did go out from some groups, was that excess compensation would go into our DBS plan, our cash balance plan. I think the reason why groups communicated that is because that was in discussion at the Capitol, and they mistakenly assumed that's what was in the bill, which was totally false. So we do want to make sure people understand that it's truly a hard cap on the DB plan and not involving a cash balance overlay to it. The second is, the market may respond to this quickly. I think we need to think about this a bit in terms of where deferred compensation plans may be started suddenly in the market by schools, and whether or not we want to roll in that in any fashion as part of our other defined contribution products that we offer. Because I would certainly expect those contracts to get renegotiated, in the future for the future members to incorporate some kind of defined contribution arrangement. So that's certainly something that we should not miss in terms of thinking about, should that be for us? Clearly others will enter the market. And then finally, although it's not the topic for today, I just wanted to flag that again for you because that affects our staff here as well, this cap. Remember, the cap is $110,000 for those that are in the state system. And for those investment staff that we have in the highly compensated area, for new employees coming in that we hire from outside the system, that's clearly going to be a considerable negative for recruitment, given that the cash part of the compensation was never stellar compared to the private sector. But the pension did mean a lot. There's no doubt about it as part of our recruitment. With us having a $110,000 hard cap for our staff, we may have to look at the law or think about whether or not that makes sense to have some type of defined contribution arrangement in place as well. But I just want to flag it to think about it differently. We don't want to just assume that this is the way it has to be and have it negatively impact our recruitment after January 1st.
Harry?
So, Jack, you just want to flag that at this point, and you don't want us to, because my sense is that the two issues you raised are relatively significant. One would be for our future members.
Yes.
The Pension 2 product is an excellent product, a supplemental. Should we, as a board, be thinking about having?
Well, it'd be legislative authorization is what we'd have to talk about, I would
So that would
assume.
go through the ledge committee. And then the issue around investment staff and other staff with the hard cap, would that also be through legislation, or do we have, that's also legislation?
We'll have to do legal review on that one. That one, we're not sure. We haven't had time to sit down with the staff one yet to think about. I don't want to answer that either way. I don't know. Relative to the members, though, the teachers, I think it's worthy of a conversation. I would hate to see this market some way recreate itself like the 403B market did with abusive products or the problems that we all have heard historically in California. So that one I'd like us to be on the front of.
Yeah, I think we need to be proactive, because my sense is that probably, smart people are sitting around thinking about opportunities that will present themselves. So,
Pleasure of the board.
through the chair, to the extent that we need to start thinking proactively about that, we should. And I don't know what the right process would be for that to happen. If it's through the ledge committee, through the full board.
Well, it really, I think what we would need to do is do some staff research on exactly what type of products would be the appropriate match for that excess benefit, and then think through the legal. We can do that. I mean, we can come back to you with some research around that and what legislatively would be required to make that happen for our members.
If it's appropriate, when we just put it out there as an information request, but in a time frame that staff thinks is appropriate to bring it back to us, so that's not a hard timeline, but one that you think would be appropriate to capture the interest, which would be if there's a product or a way in which we can address this issue, we should.
It would have to be, your comment on timeliness is very relevant. I've already received a note from one vendor in the market. I mean, it doesn't take long to recognize marketing opportunities. So you're right. We would want to be in the front of the queue if those products start to get offered in the market, if you think that's a valuable service. So let us figure out if we can do that for November.
Sure.
And Jack, it would take us having a legislative change or the ability granted through the legislative process to be able to do that, but insurance companies, other entities that do DCs would not have to go
Not at
through
all.
any of that.
Yeah.
No, those school districts could contract directly with them.
This is of essence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one virtue is that that people hitting this cap is going to happen extraordinarily gradually, because basically you have to have somebody coming in fresh to CalSTRS at $132,000. That doesn't happen very often. But still, we want to make sure that we don't let the market get away from us if that's where the board wants to go.
Well, administrators that are coming into California from other states, though,
Yeah, they would. That's
right.
Right.
I mean,
But,
that could happen next year.
Right. I mean, I looked at it. I looked at the database, and I think in 2010-11, which was the last year we had the data, I think we had 10 members making more than this who had less than a year of service. So, that gives you some sense of the pace in which that'll grow.
Okay. Any further questions on that topic? Alrighty.
So other changes applicable to future members is that there's going to be a significant restriction in what compensation counts towards a retirement benefit. Right now, there's a variety of things, as long as it's payable in cash to a member that's consistently throughout their class of employees for the performance of service, it counts towards DB or DBS, depending upon the particular circumstances. Under this bill, unless it's salary that's paid on a salary schedule that's publicly available, it's not going to count towards a retirement benefit. So that would exclude for future members things such as auto allowances, housing allowances, performance bonuses, cash in lieu of benefit payments, which is becoming more and more common throughout the state, where districts and the unions negotiate that for somebody who doesn't want to take health benefits, maybe because their spouse covers them, they get cash instead. That will no longer count for future members toward the retirement benefit. So it'll significantly reduce the amount of money that's going to be contributions are going to get paid on.
Along those lines, right now, some of that goes into the DBS.
Some of it
already.
goes into DBS, some of it goes
So
into
for
DB,
new-
depending upon the circumstances.
So for new employees, that wouldn't even be allowed to go into the
No,
DBS?
it won't go into anything. We'll get no contributions on it. We'll have no visibility of it. We'll obviously have to instruct. I mean, this is one of the things that's going to be a little complicated. Is that we're going to have to make sure the employers have to identify who's they're going to have to know who's a new member and who's not a new member to know whether or not the compensation gets reported to us or not. So this is going to be a challenge for sure.
And how much time do we have
To
to
implement
start,
this,
well, no, to start, gearing our employer reporting website to deal with, okay, so we hire somebody new next year, they become a coach, and where that would have gone into the DBS, are they gonna report on the DBS
well,
line? and
that
then-
one's not that well. A coach wouldn't be a good example, but let's say they
Okay.
hired somebody and got a cash in lieu benefit.
Okay.
Then they would have to be told for that employee, don't report that to us. They would do the reporting at the end of the pay period, which presumably ends at the end of January. So we basically have, basically have through the month of January to make sure that the employers know about the changes in reporting. Our systems can accommodate it, and their systems can accommodate it. So it's not a lot of time for sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely not.
all right, thank you.
The next change is final compensation. Right now, for members who have 25 years of service or more, their final compensation is based on their highest single year. This would now be based on their highest 3 school years, regardless of how many years of service they've got. Highest 3 consecutive school years. So, and again, there's even a provision in our law that lets districts negotiate for other members who have less than 25 years of service for their classroom teachers who meet certain criteria. They can get highest single year. That goes away as well for future members. So it's 3 years final compensation for all future members. The last change is a program that's been in place for a decade, almost more than a decade, that the federal law, Section 415 in the Internal Revenue Code, puts a limit to how much a defined benefit plan can pay out as benefits, and it depends upon how old the person is. In the Internal Revenue Code, though, they allowed public pension plans to pay a benefit on top of that if the formula of the plan provided for a bigger benefit, and what we call that the replacement benefit program. It's funded, it's properly funded, but it's funded separately from the contributions that we're getting from the employer. What this bill says is that for future members, the 415 limit is it. Now, as a practical matter, given the change in the age factor and the compensation cap, almost certainly nobody would have qualified for it anyway, but this sort of puts the nail in the coffin of no one's going to get a benefit above the 415 limit. So those are the changes that are applicable to the future members. And then there's a number of changes that apply to all members. The biggest ones being around post-retirement employment. And a month, or actually 6 weeks ago, the legislature passed a bill that was signed by the governor that made changes to the post-retirement employment rules. And generally speaking, those are continued and to some extent, and then with some modifications. The most significant change that was enacted in July that continues is that the earnings limit is increased from what was effectively half of the average salary of all the working members to half of the final compensation of all those retired in the last year. So that changed the earnings limit from about $32,000 to $40,000. So the earnings limit for this year is now $40,000. And when we will shortly identify what the earnings limit is for the next school year based on what the average final compensation was in this past fiscal year. And that's going to be the new earnings limit. There is also a change made because the earnings limit applies to everyone who performs activities that, if performed by an employee, would be creditable to CalSTRS, but the limit applies whether or not it's an employee of the district, whether it's a person working under a contract as an independent contractor of the district, or somebody who works for an employer, a third party who has a contract with the district. It doesn't matter what their employment relationship was. If they're performing that activities, one of those activities, their compensation counted. There was carved out in the AB 178, the bill from July, an exclusion that said that if you were a employee of a third party and you were working for a third party that was not part of a public retirement system and doing a job that wasn't normally performed by an employee of a school district, then you're excluded from the earnings limit. Quite honestly, we have yet to come up with an example of when that would ever occur, but it's in the law and it's there. So that's one exclusion from it, which we don't expect will ever really take place. But you never know. Somebody might come up with something.
But others do.
Yeah, but others do come up with ideas they think works, and it just doesn't seem to work. The bill also, AB 178, also took an existing exemption. Remember, there was a number of exemptions for the earnings limits, all of which sunsetted June 30th. There was one exemption that they allowed to continue for one more year. AB 340 extends it for a second year, and that's an exemption that for very specific reasons, if the state superintendent or the state school board of education or the county superintendent or the board of governors of community colleges appoint a trustee or a fiscal advisor or a special trustee to deal with the district that is either failing academically, they're going to be sanctioned under No Child Left Behind, they're failing financially, they need an emergency apportionment, or any of these very, very specific reasons, then those people can be exempted from the earnings limit for the period of their assignment now through 2013-14. But this new bill created the additional requirement that that person could not have received any incentive to retire in order and get this benefit. So over the last 5 years, there have been 5 people that have qualified for this exemption. This is an extraordinarily narrow exemption that's being applied. But the most significant change that was made in AB 340 is that right now, if you're under normal retirement age and you work in service that would otherwise count as creditable service, that anything that you earn for the first 6 months of your retirement, we reduce your benefit dollar for dollar. They've now extended that to everybody who works in the first 6 months after retirement, regardless of how old you are. The one limitation on that is that if you are over normal retirement age, the governing body can jump through a whole series of hoops on a public hearing and basically say this is a critical position, and we go through a whole lot of things, and then perhaps they can get exempted from the zero earnings limit and have the $40,000 limit applied during that first 6 months. So so basically the bottom line is, in terms of the limitations that the legislature has put on, is that the general policy is, if you're going to stop working, you'll get a retirement benefit. If you want to work, you don't retire. You can work a little bit, you can work $40,000 worth, but that's it. Beyond that, we're going to start reducing your benefit. And if you do anything in the first 6 months of your retirement, you're not going to get any benefit during that period of time, except under very extraordinary circumstances. And that's clearly the direction that the legislature was heading. And similar kinds of restrictions were put on CalPERS and the county, but done somewhat differently because theirs were done based on time, not on dollars, but it was the same general premise. Other changes made to current and future members is that after this year, you cannot buy airtime. We have to have an official application on our form by the end of this year in order to buy airtime. If we get it after this year, it's not going to be honored. And this does not apply to any other service credit that people might buy, such as redepositing prior refunds, out-of-state service credit, military service. Any of those other things are not affected by it. It's just simply the non-qualified service or airtime. Another change is that if a member commits a felony that is related to their official duties, then they forfeit the benefits that accrued after the commission of the felony. So any benefits they accrued before they committed the crime, they would get a benefit for that. But any benefits that accrue after the crime has been committed, they forfeit that benefit. We will return the contributions without interest to the member, but other than that, that's all they're going to get. Basically, and as far as our administration of it, is that the employee and the employer and the prosecuting agency are responsible for notifying us of the conviction so that we don't have to go out and read the paper to find out who's being convicted of anything. They're required to tell us within 90 days of the conviction, and then we will take action. If the conviction happens to be overturned in the future, then their benefits can be restored as if nothing had happened. The last two changes don't have limited application to us because everything is done by statute. The first one is, in the past, it's pretty common that when there are enhancements to benefits, that those enhancements tend to apply to services that performed in the past. So, for example, when we increased the age factor in 1998, that increased age factor applied to service that was performed going forward as well as for service that was already performed. Going forward, presumably the legislature, when they enact the bill, would ensure that it only applies to service that's performed in the future. So what the effect of that is that what happens is when there is a benefit enhancements that applies to prior service, there's a built-in unfunded liability associated with all of that prior service. That won't happen anymore. And then finally, there's no such thing as a pension holiday. Our contribution rates have always been fixed in statute, but with other plans, they actually reduce the contribution rate in some cases to well below the normal cost, as low as 0, and that wouldn't be able to happen anymore.
Michael?
So going back to the comment about no retroactive benefit enhancements, as I understand what you just said, since this is simply a legislative act, and any future benefit enhancement would also be a legislative act. If they passed legislation that contradicted this provision, it would simply contradict this provision. So they've said no retroactive enhancements, but they could
pass a bill that provided for retroactive enhancement.
Correct.
I mean, presumably they would say, notwithstanding this other provision, it's applied retroactively.
Right.
But but for other systems like that may enact, for example, in CalSTRS, you could negotiate for safety employees different retirement plans. They could go to a different plan, and that would not apply to prior service.
So this provision makes sense for
In other contexts.
Got it.
Right.
Got it.
It makes sense in theory for us, but there has to be a little more careful crafting for
Got
us
it.
to make sure it
Okay.
doesn't inadvertently change things. So the contribution rates is where this gets tricky in terms of what the legislation said and where we're going to have to get some clarification in terms of what was intended. With respect to the contribution rate for existing members, there's nothing in the bill that addresses the contribution rate that the existing members pay. It stays at 8% for now because that's what the statute says. But what the statute says with respect to future members is that the contribution rate that the future member pays is going to be the greater of at least 50% of the normal cost of the new plan, or whatever the current member, what we interpret as whatever the current member contribution rate, or what the contribution rate is for current members. So, and then that rate would be rounded to the nearest 0.25%. And then every time there's a valuation, if the normal cost increases or decreases by more than 1%, then the member contribution rate goes up. We interpret that right now as saying that by virtue of the board adopting a valuation that establishes a normal cost for the new plan, that sets the contribution rate that members will pay, that future members will pay going forward. So as a practical matter, that would indicate that the board is setting the member contribution rate as it applies to future members. The other provision of this is that at the local level, they could negotiate a higher member contribution rate if they so chose, but the employer is not allowed to pay any portion of the member contribution rate. So basically, if you basically are establishing a floor with the minimum contribution rate that the member is paying, they could go above that. They can negotiate something above that, but they couldn't negotiate anything below that. So that is sort of how we read this bill right now. But as it happens, because of the normal cost of this new plan that I was going to talk about in a second, the normal cost is 15.9%. Half of that is 7.95%. Round to the nearest quarter gets you to 8%. So the member contribution rate is going to be 8% anyway, even under the provisions of this bill. The initial contribution rate paid for future members is going to remain at 8%. That's not really much of an issue. What's a little more complicated is what's referred to in the bill as the public employer. The public employer is required to contribute at least an amount equal to the normal cost, less what the member contribution rate is. Now, there is nothing in the law that says this only applies to future members. That it just said this is the employer the contribution rate paid by the public employer. So arguably, it applies to the employer to existing member public employer contribution rates. The normal cost of the current plan is about 18.3%. If the member is contributing 8%, that means the public employer is going to be contributing 10.3% of pay. So that's one issue, is that arguably the employer's rate's going up. But what's making this even more complicated is that the way they defined a public employer, they defined it in terms of it means the state, or it means a political subdivision of the state, or a charter school. But it doesn't say that the public employer is the entity that actually employs the member. So both the state and what we know as the employer would fit that definition. So what raises this question is the state's contribution, which is right now about 2.5%, count towards the contribution rate that the public employer is supposed to pay, or is it on top of that? The bill is completely silent on that. So there's a struggle that you're going to have to deal with in terms of if we probably want to get some clarification one way or the other and get it in the statute, but that statute won't take effect until sometime next year, and it may not become effective until January of 2014. But something has to happen in the meantime. So what we are suggesting is, because the bills say that the contribution rate has to be at least equal to the normal cost, that you could read the language to say that what is at least equal to the normal cost is the existing member's contribution rate of 8%, the existing employer contribution rate of 8.25%, and the existing state's contribution is provided in statute, which right now is 2.541%, and will be going up another 0.25% in October. And that would harmonize the existing law with what the bill says. So that's what we're suggesting be done. And to make this happen, we would have to put an item to set these rates. We will have to put an item in the November meeting to have you identify to officially adopt a normal cost for this new plan, which, as I said, the current estimate is about 15.9%, but we'll do a more detailed analysis to see what it actually is, and that would sort of trigger all these other things. So I don't know if Brian wants to.
It's going really fast in trying to give you a lot of these issues, but these have to be, these have to be vetted. There are legal issues. Ed and his staff are trying to go back and work with the legislature for some clarification on what was intended here. We're trying to come up with solutions for because you have to put something in place soon. We think the legal staff thinks that the member contribution rate, since it's keyed off the normal cost, which is keyed off the valuation, so the board doesn't set the contribution rate, but indirectly moves that needle. I think we think that statutory scheme works. And remember, this bill is notwithstanding any other provision of law, so you could say that then that obviates or supersedes the teacher's retirement law on that piece. The second piece that Ed just mentioned, or the teacher's retirement law, it says the member's contribution rate is 8%. This is for future members. But the last piece that Ed was walking through, that's a lot more complex, and we're going to provide as much information and analysis as we can, and we are, we're all struggling with this. So, right now this is a pretty high level, rapid, staccato kind of presentation, but I just want you to know that we're not asking you to make a decision on how we're going to apply this right now. Ed's just giving you our preliminary thinking.
Yeah, but just so that you're aware of this is an issue that needs to get addressed.
Thanks, Ed.
I have a couple of speakers for you, Ed. So, Paul?
Yeah, this is a lot to figure out. So I'm just trying to back up a little bit because I got a couple of questions. Okay, so for new members, they're required to contribute 50% of the normal cost. And by us taking action about what the normal cost is, because of assumptions we adopt, that thereby effectively establishes what their share of the normal cost is, and therefore what their contribution is.
Correct.
what I'm not sure I understand is I think what Brian is referring to as the second piece, and what, I'm not even quite sure what the second piece is. It has to,
That's the slide that's up. I'm sorry to interrupt. That's the slide that's up. Where's the other 50% going to come from?
right, okay, so Ed was saying that I guess what I'm wondering is there something in this that is besides that, besides the 50% of the normal cost, is there something in this that is helping to address the funding problem, or is it just reallocating the current obligation to make the payments that are in statute?
The bill, I mean, the contribution rates that are identified in the law all relate to the normal cost. They don't address the unfunded liability at all. I mean, it would be, I think it would be difficult to suggest that it
No,
does.
that's not what I meant. I
Yeah.
guess that's
Oh, okay.
that's not what I mean, they'll, I mean, subject to what they're trying to suggest
Right.
in San Jose and San Diego, the concept of a defined benefit program is that the employee doesn't take the risk
Mm-hmm.
of the unfunded liability.
Right.
So I'm assuming that there's nothing in this that would suggest the new employees, if an unfunded liability arises, that they have a responsibility for
Correct.
that. It's just they have 50% responsibility for the normal cost.
Correct.
But what you're saying is that beyond that, it's a little unclear who has the responsibility for the rest of it, both the normal cost and any unfunded liability that might arise.
Right, and the reason why it's unclear in our system, unlike any other system, is that we have two other sources of revenue, and that's not true with other pension systems where there's only the employer.
But does this change, but I guess what I thought I heard you say is that maybe this changes that side of the equation for current employees. It doesn't change the 8% obligation of the current employees to make their contribution, but it might change the contributions or the sharing of the contributions between the state and the employers for current members.
It could, because because the way the bill is drafted, in the member side of it, it says it's for new members only. On the employer side of it, it doesn't say that. So it affects all members, I mean, the employers of all members, because there's nothing to suggest it was limited to just the new members.
And so what does it say that the employer's responsibility is?
The public employer's responsibility is the normal cost less the member contribution rate. But the question is that we have two public
I
employers
see. Okay.
in every circumstance, other than
normal
a
cost
limited handful.
And the normal cost for current employees is now about 18.3%, and for new employees,
It's
the estimate is
15.9.
going to be 15.9.
Right.
Thank you.
So for the existing employees, the contribution rate would be higher than what it currently is for the real employer, and for the future employees, it would be lower than the 8.25% that's currently paid.
But at 8.25% from the employer, 8% from the member, 2.541% from the state, we're above the 18.3.
Yes,
anyway.
there's a small normal cost surplus to it.
Right. So.
Right.
So it doesn't. Okay. So.
Well, except the difficulty is if it got calibrated entirely on the normal cost for the existing employees, then we'd actually be taking in less money now than we are. I mean, in the future than we are now, and that small increment does help retire the unfunded liability to a small degree.
I see. In other words, if in fact the contributions of the employer and the state then got recalibrated down to only being the normal cost.
Yes.
Then we wouldn't have, because right now we've got about a 1%.
Right. We'd be
So
worse off.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Michael?
Just going back to this statutory contribution requirement on the employer for a second. Does that, and I'm going to address this to Brian, in your further analysis of this, and you don't need to answer this now, but in your further analysis of this whole structure, if you would examine whether this, in any way, shape, or form, affects our fiduciary responsibility as a board. And I ask that question in the context of my understanding of our responsibilities have always been limited to managing the assets and managing the administration of this system. That we neither set contribution rates, nor are we responsible for collecting the contribution rates, in part because of the fact that there was some discretion on the part of the public employer, whoever that was, as to what that contribution should be. We set the discount rate, the actuaries tell us what the contribution should be, but we didn't have control over the amount that needed to be contributed. What I'm hearing is that this section of the statute may actually establish a minimum contribution that the quote-unquote public employer is required to make based on our determination of what the normal cost is. And if that is indeed the case, and we don't receive that amount in a particular year from whatever sources there might be out there, I'd like you to address the question of whether we have any obligation to enforce that provision. And if we don't, then who does?
Certainly. We'll look at that very much, because it is part of your fiduciary duty to deliver an actuarially sound pension system. So, that's a really key issue. So we will look at that. And of course, we'll talk with fiduciary counsel about that as well.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ed.
Okay. So in terms of the
Go ahead, Paul.
sorry.
Just one more, so much here.
Amen.
So if we change assumptions such that the normal cost for existing employees goes up and doesn't change the 8% contribution that the existing employees make, but now there isn't enough being paid to get up to the normal cost between the 8.25% from the employers and the currently 2.541 from the state. Does that mean that the law now requires that either the state or the employers kick in more money because they have an obligation to make up the difference to get to the normal cost?
It would seem to suggest that, but there's no direction about who ends up paying it. I mean, it's the difficulty of a bill that was written generically and it didn't address the uniqueness that CalSTRS operates on in a number of areas. So that's one of the things that we need. We want to get this. I think it's really an issue of just trying to make sure we understand, getting everybody on the same page about what is it you're trying to do, and we'll draft a bill that does it.
Right. But then both with current employees, not with the employees, but with the employer.
The
and
employers
the state.
of that employee.
Right. And with new employees, I mean, our determination of the normal cost potentially has an impact on the contributions that the employees, the employer, or the state is making. And the only circumstance is that it doesn't have an effect on the contribution that the current employee would be making.
But quite honestly, I mean, that's not that uncommon. I mean, CalPERS doesn't affect a member, but it's new for us. It's new for this system, for sure. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So in terms of the fiscal impact of all of this, and again, these are preliminary analyses. We had the language the night that the conference committee adopted the report, and we asked, we did a very quick analysis just because the legislature wanted to know what did this actually end up doing financially. So as I've said, it reduces the normal cost benefits for future members, and it's 18.5%. I'm going to make sure because I said it was 18.3. 18.3 is what the normal cost is for the existing plan as it applies to everybody in the system. 18.5 is the normal cost as it applies to the future members. So that's a different number, but you'll never see the 18.5%. And we're just trying to give you a frame of reference. But the normal cost of this new plan for the future members would be the preliminary estimate is about 15.9%. That's what will drive everything else. Over the next 30 years, the estimate is that the savings in reduced accruals of benefits for the new members would equal $22.7 billion, which translates into about a $12 billion savings if you adjust everything for inflation at our assumed rate of 3%. So it's the $22.7 billion, though, is the number that we reported. We actually reported both numbers, but that was the number that people used to be consistent with the way that CalPERS characterized their savings. So again, if you adjust for inflation, it's obviously something less than that. The table there shows you what the savings would be in the contributions paid by the future members, the employers, and the state because compensation that currently counts towards a retirement benefit will no longer count. This is not at all affected by this issue about the contribution rates that people pay. It's just simply on compensation that is currently creditable will no longer be creditable, and that reduces the contributions that all the various stakeholders are paying by a little over $1.25 billion over 30 years, which is equal to about 2/3 of $1 billion over in inflation-adjusted dollars. But the other significant thing is that although this reduced accrual of benefits doesn't affect the unfunded liability as we see it today, it does affect what needs to get done in the future to amortize that unfunded liability. So to the extent that contributions are going to go up or benefits get reduced even more in the future to address the unfunded liability of the system, you've basically reduced the need to make those changes by about $4.9 billion. So it's a small down payment in addressing the funding situation, but it's there, and we want to make sure that we quantify it. So that's what AB 340 did. The governor doesn't yet have the bill. It's still in enrollment. We obviously anticipate he will sign it sometime before the end of the month. And then we are even in anticipation of his signature, we are starting implementation of it because we've got to get information out there. We've got to make changes to our system. We want to make sure that the employers know what they need to do. We want to make sure the members know what's going to be different. Right now, what we've put on our website is a summary table that shows each of the provisions and what it did and what impact it has on a CalSTRS member and who it applies to. We are finishing up a more detailed analysis, about 9 pages long, that sort of steps through how the plan works now and what the specific changes that are made to the plan and who it applies to, and that'll be on our website probably by the end of next week. So we are, and we encourage everybody who's their organizations to please utilize that information. And if you have any questions about what it does, we're happy to sort of review their communications to make sure that people get it right. But that's pretty much, that's pretty much the extent of how we see it, at least at this point in time. I'd be happy to answer any of the questions.
Anybody? I don't have anyone else in the queue.
Thank you.
We're good?
Tons of questions, but not right now.
So, Ed.
On second thought, I want to go back because there was a series of questions, and I'm not raising new information. I'm just saying that as far as the applicability of the normal cost to employers for current members, that's not crystal clear in the law. So I do want to go back and make sure that, and I believe Ed did preface that by saying arguably, and that's an interpretation. I mean, you look at a statutory scheme as a whole, and that doesn't seem to fit with the whole intention of how. So we'll have more discussions. We'll take a look at it. I think there's the preamble to the legislation says that this applies to employers following January 1, 2013. So you might be able to read that statute through the preamble. And I mean, there are other things that we're going to have to look at to get more detail. So because we went off on that current member and employer issue, I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that that was preliminary review.
Statute is not crystal clear?
It's a rare, and Ed didn't write it this time, so it's very rare.
I'm going to keep my mouth shut on that one too. Ed, I'm interested in having a copy of your presentation. Is there anyone else on the board that would like that?
Sure.
If you
We'll
could
make sure
send
we
that to
you.
everyone, please,
Yep,
that would be
we'll
great.
do that.
Thank you, Ed. We really appreciate your work and your crew's work on that. It's been an interesting journey. I don't like living in interesting times.
You wanna
Alrighty.
mention this here one more time?
Item 8, business renewal oversight assessment. Graham and Janice. I hope you're feeling
Before we
much
do that, I
better.
just wanted to make sure, before you get too comfortable, I just want to make sure that people are aware of the fact that, as we told you, that Senate Concurrent Resolution 105 was adopted by the legislature in the last night of session as well. And so that sort of establishes a framework for some really good discussions around the funding of the plan and working with the stakeholders, and most importantly, it expressed the intent of the legislature to enact a bill next session to deal with the long-term funding needs of the DB program. So we're going to start that process, and we'll give you more details as time progresses.
So that December meeting, we'd like to have about a 2-3 hour session, public session with you around that, the funding strategy and working with the stakeholders and the board's role in shaping that funding strategy. So we want to flag that day here.
Hi. So
Hope you're feeling better?
a little, but if I start coughing during the middle of my presentation, that's why. So well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to present our monthly status update on the 3 business renew projects for which we provide oversight. In consideration of the clock, I'll try and be pretty brief on the presentation, and then I'll leave questions at the end if you have any questions. So let's start with CALM. CALM we have rated as yellow plus, which is the same rating we had last time we talked to you, and that's again primarily related to the schedule issues the project's had. If you remember, a couple of months ago, the project had gone through a replanning exercise and had moved the projected implementation date from October 1st to November 1st. The project is having problems keeping to that schedule. They're behind on some of the development activities required to make that date. So we feel, although the project has started testing activities, we feel it's unlikely that the project will hit that November 1st deadline. The project is, well aware of the challenges they're facing on the schedule front, and in fact, they're currently going through another replanning exercise to determine what impact there might be to the go-live date. And we're anticipating that the project team will have a recommendation to the CALM steering committee around the middle of the month in terms of any changes that might be required. From a recommendation and observation perspective, we've been pretty consistent throughout the project that our first priority is the quality of the software, and second priority is the implementation timeline. So we've been pretty consistent in encouraging the project team to focus a lot on the entrance and exit criteria for the various testing cycles. The 3 cycles of integration testing that the project is going through, IT1, which is now underway, IT2, and then finally user acceptance testing, or UAT. And we're really focusing our efforts on looking at the extent to which the project is putting in place and maintaining objective entrance and exit criteria for each one of those cycles, so that the project doesn't move from one test cycle to the next until it's ready and that the software is in a suitable state of quality. And that's going to continue to be our focus over the next couple of months. So move on to pension solution. We rate pension solution green as it was last time we talked to you. The project has exited the discovery stage. It's now in the requirements stage. The project has begun defining requirements. They received executive leadership approval also recently to move ahead with procurement planning, and is just starting market research activities. And those are really going to be kicking off in earnest in the next few weeks. There's no action of the board at this time, but what we are focusing on over the next couple of months are 2 things. The first is confirming that the business requirements development process that the project is executing hasn't impacted at all the CALM resources. That was sort of one of the criteria that the project had for being able to go ahead, was that they had a strategy that would allow them to proceed without impacting CALM, and we'll be monitoring that, particularly if the CALM project decides to modify its schedule, whether there'll be an impact to the pension solution project as well and how it's going to adjust for that. And secondly, we anticipate the project gathering a lot of useful information through their market research activities in the next few months. And we want to see how they're leveraging that information actively to mitigate the risk on the procurement. So those are the major focus areas for pension solution. Then on the data preparation project, we continue to rate this project yellow plus, and that was mainly due to the delays the project experienced with a data analysis RFP that was issued and then canceled. The project is re-releasing that RFP. It's due to be released imminently, which I think is a positive step. Concurrently with that, the project is continuing its data cleansing activities. While the detailed schedule for the future data analysis and cleansing activities won't really be known until an award is made to the data analysis vendor, based on the currently anticipated schedule, if the project is able to keep to the current schedule in terms of issuing the RFP and making an award when they think they will, we think there's a low probability that there'll be any impact to the pension solution timeline. That was one of the risks we were tracking, that if the data analysis procurement was delayed enough, it might impact pension solution because the data quality activities wouldn't be complete when the pension solution project needed them. Given the timeline that the project appears to be on right now, we think that's a fairly low risk. But again, we'll be tracking it during the timeline of the data analysis RFP. That's it in a nutshell. I'll take questions.
Pedro?
What was the original implementation date for CARM?
It was October 1st.
So first, we just have 1 month delay, but I think in Jack's write-up, he speaks to potential move. Do we have a sense now, in light of the yellow on this thing, what the new date would be?
Just in another week, we'll have the teams come together and make a recommendation. But that's exactly where we are now, recognizing that the date's getting closer. We need to, I think, set a definite expectation. But this is all, I'm trying to be as practical about this. Again, this is a plus or minus a month or two discussion. So, that's what it's going to take. So by the next time we meet, we will have re-baselined this with our sense of it.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, anybody else? All righty. Thank you.
Thank you.
More chicken noodle soup. Thanks, Janice. All righty. Jennifer, if you want to go quickly over the things that we referred by the committee. Oh, we didn't have anything from committees for board decisions, but the review information request, we have taking a look at possibly offering our own DC for the salary that's above and beyond the hard cap out of the pension reform. Did we have anything else?
I just also have the fiduciary duty regarding contribution rates.
There you go. All right, anything else that anybody remembers? Alrighty, draft agenda for the next meeting, item 11.
So we've added some items for November back on this possible legislation if we proceed around what we just said, the excess earnings or other issues of clarification. Or what else would you have around pension reform?
Establishment of the normal cost.
Yeah, establishment of the normal cost. The only thing I'm trying to think through, remember we reduced our schedule in November to 2 days. So I'll have to, apart from the important stuff you're going to do in the board, I think I need to go back and just look at the other committees' responsibilities. We've got our financial statements and our external audit, which we must do in November, of course. So you got a pretty heavy agenda. I'm going to have to go back with this added part. This adds a good hour or two what we just talked about. So I hope we can get through it okay.
Like what we're looking at in appeals, at least right now.
We don't have any outstanding decisions that we're waiting on.
You don't? Okay.
There's a couple hearings coming up, so and maybe some by November.
There could be something by November.
Days, so.
Okay.
All right.
All right,
So I'll do
thanks.
that soon. I'll go back and assess all the timing for you.
All right, thanks, Jack.
Yeah.
Any questions on that? Alrighty, any statements from the public? And before we adjourn for our closed session, Miss Loretta, would you please stand up?
Yay, Loretta.
We want to thank you. We want to welcome you back to CalSTRS. looking hale and hearty, and we appreciate seeing your pretty little face back there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Loretta. Alrighty.
So we don't have time clearly today for any investment committee piece. So after the closed session, we'll be done for the day.
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll start with investments tomorrow at 9.
Alrighty. We're adjourned then.